There's a scene in Chamber of Secrets that most people forget. Ron sits at the Hogwarts table on the first day back at school, and he sees the Malfoys laughing. They have new robes, new wands that are better than his. Money means nothing to them. And in that moment, Ron feels it, the weight of being less. But the Weasley story isn't actually about being poor. It's about something deeper. It's about survival, about making impossible choices, and about a family that loved each other more than they loved gold. This is the untold story of how the Weasleys didn't just survive poverty, they thrived in it. Start with this. The Weasley family had a choice to make before Harry Potter was even born. The First Wizarding War was raging. Voldemort was hunting. Families were choosing sides. And the Weasleys, a modest pureblood family with a decent amount of inherited wealth, had to decide what mattered more, safety or principle. Other families made different choices. The Malfoys made a calculated gamble. They supported Voldemort, hedged their bets, and when he fell, they claimed they were under the Imperious Curse. They kept their gold. They kept their status. They kept their power. The Weasleys chose the order. They chose to fight. They chose to stand with Albus Dumbledore, even though it meant their children would grow up in a world where their choices made them targets. That decision cost them. It cost them family members. It cost them time, and it cost them money. When Arthur Weasley went to work at the Ministry, he didn't go to a high-paying job. He went to the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, a job that paid barely enough to keep a family of 7 alive. Why? Because Arthur believed in it. He believed in helping magical creatures. He believed in the Ministry's mission, even when the Ministry didn't believe in funding him. That's who the Weasleys were. Not people who wanted to be poor, but people who wanted to be right more than they wanted to be rich. Molly Weasley, the heart of the family, watched this reality unfold. She had 7 children, 7, and she made sure each one of them had what they needed. Not what they wanted, what they needed. Ginny wore hand-me-down robes because her brothers had worn them first. Ron's wand was broken and repaired with tape because a new one would have cost galleons they didn't have. The Weasley children learned young that there were families, the Malfoys, the Knots, the other pure-blood families, who had things just given to them. And then there were families like theirs, where every galleon mattered. But here's what the films never showed. The Weasleys didn't feel sorry for themselves. They adapted. When Bill and Charlie got to Hogwarts, they wore second-hand robes that had been passed down. When Percy arrived, he got Bill's robes. When the twins came, they shared everything, even their clothes sometimes. And by the time Ron and Ginny arrived, the robes were held together by magic and determination. But those robes carried something else. They carried history. They carried the knowledge that each brother had survived Hogwarts in them, that they'd made friends, passed exams, and grown into themselves wearing the same threadbare fabric. The Burrow reflected this same philosophy. It was falling apart, yes, but it was falling apart with love. Every room that leaned at an odd angle had been lived in by a Weasley child. Every magical repair Arthur made was an act of devotion. The house wasn't beautiful in the way Malfoy Manor was beautiful. Cold, controlled, perfect. It was beautiful in the way a lived-in home is beautiful. It was chaotic and warm and real. And when friends came to visit, when Harry came to stay, the Weasleys never made him feel like they were poor. They made him feel like he belonged. They fed him Mrs. Weasley's cooking. They included him in their pranks. They treated him like a son. That's not something gold can buy. But the financial reality was real, and it shaped each Weasley child differently. Very differently. Because poverty doesn't just affect a family's bank account. It shapes who you become. It teaches you things that privilege never could. And for the Weasleys, each child learned a different lesson from growing up without. Bill Weasley, the dutiful son. Bill chose to become a curse breaker because it was exciting and because it paid better than most other options available to him. But that choice came with responsibility. Bill understood, even as a young man at Hogwarts, that his success would help his family. His salary would be his contribution. His earning potential was part of the family's survival plan. He was dutiful, almost burdened by it. When Bill got his first job at Gringotts, he sent money home. Not all of it. He needed to survive on his own salary too. But what he could spare, he sent back to the Burrow. He watched from a distance as his mother used those galleons to buy new robes for Charlie, to repair the house, to feed his younger siblings. But there was a cost to this. Bill couldn't fully escape his family's circumstances. He couldn't go to the fancy wizarding clubs in London. He couldn't buy expensive robes or travel extensively. He had to live modestly even as he began to earn well, because his first loyalty was always to his family. That's the burden of being the oldest, of being the first to have options. When he met Fleur Delacour during the Triwizard Tournament, something shifted. Fleur came from money. Not Malfoy money, but solid, comfortable wizarding wealth. She was beautiful, accomplished, and she represented a different world entirely. A world where you didn't have to send your salary home, where you could keep what you earned. But Bill chose Fleur for love, not for her family's wealth. And he chose to stay grounded in who he was, a Weasley, a curse breaker, a son who sent money home. And then came the curse. Charlie Weasley, the peace seeker. Charlie was different from Bill. Where Bill was dutiful, Charlie was free. He didn't want to climb the ministry ladder. He didn't want prestige or status. He wanted dragons. His decision to work with dragons in Romania was on the surface a poor choice. Dragon handlers make decent money, but not exceptional money. It was choosing personal happiness over financial security. And in a family where security was already fragile, that choice had weight. But Charlie understood something that his brothers and sisters would take longer to learn. Money doesn't buy happiness, and chasing it doesn't make you happy either. In Romania, Charlie was safe in a different way. He was away from the conflict brewing in Britain. He was away from the tensions of his family's poverty. He was doing work he loved, surrounded by creatures that didn't judge him based on his bank account or his blood status. When Voldemort returned, when the war came, Charlie had to make a choice. Stay safe in Romania with his dragons, or come home and fight. He came home, and he did it without hesitation. Because Charlie had learned something in those years away. Family matters more than safety. Love matters more than distance. Percy Weasley, the ambitious one. Percy's story is the most painful of all, because Percy felt his family's poverty more acutely than his brothers. He was embarrassed by it. He was embarrassed by his father's job at the ministry. He thought his father should have climbed higher, done better, made more. He was embarrassed by his mother's hand-knitted jumpers, the ones she made for each of them every Christmas, pulling gold thread through wool to spell out their initials. To Percy, at a certain age, those jumpers weren't signs of love. They were signs of their poverty. He was embarrassed by the Burrow, with its leaning rooms and its magical instability. He was embarrassed by sharing robes with his brothers. He was embarrassed by the secondhand nature of his entire childhood. And so Percy decided to escape. He was going to be different, better, more successful. He was going to climb the ministry ranks and show them all that a Weasley could be important, could be respected, could be somebody. His ambition was fierce. His determination was absolute. He became a prefect, a head boy. He earned outstanding marks. He built a path to power and prestige, and he walked it without looking back. But ambition, when it's rooted in shame, leads to dark places. When Dolores Umbridge came to Hogwarts, Percy saw an opportunity. Here was someone powerful, someone important, someone who represented authority and status, and she seemed to like him. She seemed to recognize his potential. She offered him a path to power that didn't require years of climbing. It required only loyalty. And Percy, desperate to prove that he was better than his family, chose the wrong person to be loyal to. The years when Percy sided with Umbridge and the ministry against his own family were years of profound shame. His family didn't speak to him for months. Molly Weasley, who loved him unconditionally, was heartbroken. Arthur, who'd spent his entire career trying to do good work at the ministry, watched his own son betray the family's values for position. Percy told himself it was the right choice, that he was making the mature decision, that his family was on the wrong side of history. But deep down, he knew. He knew he was running away. He was choosing prestige over principle, position over love, status over family, and the cost of that choice nearly destroyed him. When Percy finally came back, when the war made clear what mattered and what didn't, his redemption was complete. But it wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. He had to face the reality that all his ambition, all his climbing, all his desperate need to be better than his family origins had come to nothing. What mattered was that his family forgave him. What mattered was that he was a Weasley, that he belonged to them, that love was stronger than shame. Fred and George Weasley, the creators. The twins responded to poverty with something their brothers didn't have. They responded with imagination. They couldn't afford the newest joke supplies from Zonko's. They couldn't buy novelty items or prank equipment, so they made their own. They created their own products, designed their own tricks, invented their own pranks. This creativity wasn't accidental. It was born from necessity. When you can't buy something, you learn to make it. When you don't have resources, you become resourceful. By the time Fred and George were in their 5th year, they'd already begun building their empire. They had a network of students willing to test their products. They'd created a catalog in their minds of what worked and what didn't. They understood their market, even though they were still teenagers. Their response to poverty wasn't shame like Percy's. It wasn't escape like Charlie's. It was transformation. They turned their lack of resources into an advantage. They learned to think creatively, to solve problems, to see opportunity where others saw limitation. But they also learned something darker. They learned that society valued things like academic achievement and respectable careers, and they didn't care. They'd rather be happy, be free, and build something that was theirs. When Voldemort returned, the twins didn't become soldiers in the traditional sense, but they fought in their own way. They fought with humor, with resistance, with refusal to take the darkness seriously. And when Fred died in the Battle of Hogwarts, they were separated in a way that would haunt George forever. The death of Fred wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was the loss of the other half of a whole. Twin bonds are different. They're not quite like sibling bonds. There's something more fundamental. And when Fred was killed by a wall explosion, George lost part of himself. The grief of that loss shaped George forever. No amount of money, no amount of success with the joke shop could fully heal that wound, because some losses are too big for gold to fix. Ron and Ginny felt the family's poverty most acutely and most directly. They were the youngest. By the time they came to Hogwarts, they had 5 older brothers who'd already gone through the school. That meant hand-me-downs weren't just a fact of life, they were an identity. Ron's robes were patched. His wand was broken and taped together. When he went to Hogwarts for the first time, he had the hand-me-down robes of Bill, then Charlie, then Percy, then the twins. He had a second-hand wand that was barely functional. He had a rat instead of an owl or a cat, because the family couldn't afford a proper pet. And he knew it. He was aware of it every single moment. When he sat at the Hogwarts table and saw the Malfoys in their pristine robes, made fresh and new and expensive. When he saw other students with new wands, perfect robes, fancy equipment, he knew that he was different, that he came from less. It would have been easy for Ron to become bitter about this. It would have been understandable if he'd felt resentful toward his family or toward the world that made such distinctions. Some children do. But Ron learned something crucial in his poverty. He learned that gold doesn't determine worth. When Ron met Harry Potter, Harry was famous, fabulously wealthy, an orphan who'd inherited a fortune. Harry had everything that Ron didn't have: status, money, fame, a future assured by gold. And Ron didn't become Harry's friend because of any of that. He became Harry's friend because Harry was lonely. Because Harry, despite all his advantages, didn't have a real friend. Because when Harry came to sit next to Ron at the Hogwarts table, Ron recognized something in him, a loneliness that matched his own, just dressed in different circumstances. Their friendship was built on genuine connection, not on gold. And that friendship, one of the most important relationships in the entire story, was forged not despite their different financial circumstances, but partly because Ron understood in his bones that wealth didn't matter. But Ginny's story is the one that matters most here, because Ginny was the only girl, the only daughter, and poverty hit her differently than it hit her brothers. She was the youngest. By the time Ginny came to Hogwarts, she had 5 older brothers who'd already worn the school robes. That meant everything was hand-me-down. Her robes were patched and re-hemmed so many times they barely fit right. Her wand was broken, held together with tape like Ron's, because new ones cost galleons the family didn't have. But worse than that was the isolation. There were no older Weasley girls to prepare her, no sisters to pass down secrets or advice, just 5 brothers in a world of richer families with daughters who had new robes and new wands and parents who bought them things without thinking twice. Ginny learned young that she wasn't like the other girls at Hogwarts, but unlike some children who become bitter about this, Ginny became fierce. She learned that being poor didn't make her less worthy. If anything, it made her stronger. She played Quidditch better than most boys. She cursed better than most girls. She survived on less and thrived anyway. When she met Harry, she didn't see a famous wizard with a fortune. She saw a boy who understood what it meant to not belong. A boy who, despite all his advantages, was just as lonely as she was. And she loved him, not because of his gold, but in spite of it, because she'd learned that real worth had nothing to do with galleons. Then came the Chamber of Secrets. Ginny was possessed by Voldemort's memory when she was 11 years old. An 11-year-old girl forced to carry a piece of the darkest wizard alive inside her, doing things she didn't understand. By the time the chamber was open, she'd already been violated by the most invasive magic imaginable. She survived, but survival isn't healing. Years later, when the real Voldemort returned, Ginny fought in the Battle of Hogwarts. She nearly died. She was tortured, she was hunted, and she survived that too. But again, not without scars, not without trauma that would follow her forever. Molly Weasley had to watch all of this. Her children dying, Fred dead, George broken, Bill scarred, Ginny traumatized, Ron on the run. And she held the family together because that's what mothers do. Because love teaches you that you survive so your children can survive. The Weasleys went through that war the way they'd gone through everything else. Not with gold or resources or advantage, but with each other. Here's what most people miss. Being poor isn't the same as being broken. The Weasleys had nothing, but they had everything. Voldemort saw weakness when he looked at them. 7 children barely fed, a father who chose principle over profit, a mother patching robes, a house falling apart. What he didn't see was this: Arthur Weasley raising children who understood that doing the right thing mattered more than being rich. Molly Weasley creating a home so full of love that even Harry Potter, a boy raised in a cupboard by people who hated him, felt safe there. When the final battle came, the Weasleys showed that love was worth more than all the gold in all the vaults. Because love is what you fight for. Love is what you die for. The Malfoys had gold, and they lost their son. Not to death, but to privilege. Draco was never allowed to be a person, just a symbol, a tool of his parents' ambition. He was given everything and had nothing. The Weasleys had nothing, and they had everything. They raised children who knew their own worth, regardless of circumstances. Children who would fight for what was right, not what was profitable. The aftermath, when money came but nothing changed. By the end, the Weasleys had money. Ron married Hermione, who climbed the ministry ranks. Ginny married Harry, who inherited a fortune. The twins' joke shop exploded. Bill found his way back to curse breaking. But here's what mattered. None of that wealth changed them. They stayed fundamentally themselves, because money had never defined them. Character did, values did, love did. The Weasleys were never poor in the ways that mattered. They were never poor in courage, never poor in loyalty, never poor in the ability to love and be loved in return. By the time the series ended, they'd become wealthy, but they'd always been rich. Rich in the ways that gold can never measure. Rich in the ways Voldemort spent his whole life trying to understand and never could. And that's a kind of richness that gold can never buy.